Okay, this lesson is on margin of error. The definition of margin of error is the degree of error in random sampling surveys is known as the margin of error. So the whole point of margin of error is to see where there is a discrepancy in your data when you're doing surveys. The formula for margin of error, which I have already started to highlight for you, is 2 times S over the square root of n. So it will look like this, times S over the square root of n is how the function will look when you're typing it into your Desmos. So, for example, Lorraine surveyed 25 randomly chosen students at her school who sleep 8 hours each night. The mean grade point average of these students was 3.15, and the standard deviation was 0.85 grade points, which statement is true. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the information so that we can plug it into Desmos and find the margin of error. So what we know is that the amount of students that were surveyed were 25 students, okay? And they were randomly chosen. And the mean grade point average of these students was 3.15, okay? 3.15. And the standard deviation was 0.85. Which statement is true? So when we're looking at standard deviation, what we do know is that the letter that we are focusing on is n. Okay, so your n down here, this is your sample size. Okay, the n is your sample size. The s, this is your standard deviation. Okay, that is your standard deviation. So the pieces of information that we need from here is our sample size. Our sample size is going to be this 25 because we have 25 students that were surveyed, and our standard deviation, which is 0.85. So we're going to plug in to Desmos 2 times our standard deviation, which is 0.85, over the square root of 25. Okay, and that is what we're looking at. So let's go to Desmos, and we're going to plug that into our function. So we're going to plug in 2 times our standard deviation, which was 0.85, divided by the square root of 25. So we see right here that they gave us a standard deviation of 0.34. Okay, 0.34. So when we go back to here, we see that our margin of error is 0.34. Okay, so in our questions, when we're looking at it, it says for A, the margin of error was 0.6. That is incorrect because we calculated the margin of error to be 0.34. Then it says the margin of error was 1.26. Again, that is incorrect because we calculated the margin of error to be 0.34. So C and D, one of those will be our answer. But the answers for C and D says, if Lorraine decreases the sample size to 10, the margin of error decreases from 0.34 to 0.17. So to check that, we're going to take 25 and change that to 10 to see if our margin of error changes. So we go back to Desmos, and we take our 25, and we change that to 10. That did not give us 1.7, it gave us 0.53. So when we go back to our question, the next one says she increased the sample size to 100. So when we go here to Desmos again, let's make our sample size 100, and we got 0.17. It says if Lorraine increases the sample size to 100, the margin of error decreases from 0.34 to 0.7. And that is exactly what happened when we changed this number from 25 to 100. Our margin of error decreased from 0.34 to 0.17. So our answer for that question is D. Now, something I want you to remember about margin of error is that when your sample size increases, if your sample increases, your margin of error, which is MOE, your margin of error will decrease. Okay? And if your sample size decreases, your MOE, again, your margin of error, which is your MOE, your margin of error increases. Okay? So the smaller the sample size, the bigger the margin of error. The larger the sample size, the smaller the margin of error. Okay? So let's go now to question 2. Question 2 says a teacher randomly chooses 16 students out of 42 students and records the time it takes each student to complete a book study. The mean time was 115 minutes with a standard deviation of 13.5 minutes. What is the approximate margin of error? So looking at this, it says a teacher randomly chose 16 students out of 42 students. Do not let that confuse you because she only chose 16 students. So my sample size is going to be 16. So my N equals 16. The mean time was 115. So 115 is your mean. And the standard deviation was 13.5. Do not let all these numbers confuse you. You only need the information we're looking for, which is standard deviation and the sample size. So my S is going to equal 13.5. So we're plugging it in. 2 times 13.5 over my my sample size, which is the square root of 16. So let's plug that in. Let's change some numbers here. We're going to change that to 16. And we're going to change the top to 13.5. Let's make sure I was right. Yep. And my answer is 6.75. Okay, so this is what we got, 6.75. And so now my answer should be B. Okay? All right, I want you to try number 6 and tell me what your answer is. So for number 6, you should have had your standard deviation, which is your S. Your S should have equaled 15. And she surveyed 500 people, so your N equals 500. So your equation is 2 times 15 over the square root of 500. And if you plug that into decimals, your margin of error is 1.34. So my answer should be C. That's what you should have gotten for number 6. All right. What I want you to do now is look at 7, 8, and 9, and I want you to complete them on your own. And I'm basically going to give you a chance to do those, and then put your answers in, and you can turn your sheet in, and we'll check it. So for number 7, it says Aziz surveyed 80 11th graders. And the mean of the sample was 40 minutes with the standard deviation of 15. What could decrease the margin of error? I talked about that already. I said for margin of error, let's go back up to the top of the sheet. I said that the sample increases, the margin of error decreases. So in order for us to decrease the margin of error, he must increase the sample size. Okay, we're going to increase the sample size. So in order for the margin of error to decrease, we must increase the sample size. All right. For number 8, all the information about the police chief was not important because it only asked you one question. It says which choice would decrease the margin of error. All of this was not significant. Your question asked which choice would decrease the margin of error. So in order for your margin of error to decrease, you must increase the sample size. And for number 9, same thing. A video game studied, their study was surveying 1,500 teenagers. The mean time they spent playing the game at 115 minutes. Your standard deviation is 11, which would decrease the margin of error for this study. So your sample size was 1,500. So again, in order to decrease the margin of error, you must increase your sample size. So the answer would be B.